Hello everyone, this is Oculus Imperia, filling in for Remlias on this new episode of 40k Lore for Newcomers. For this episode, nominated on Patreon by Josh Bunton, we will be taking a brief look at the Siege of Vraks. This video will be a brief overview for certain events that may be explored in greater depth with additional videos in the future. Without further ado, let's begin.
For Vraks, we will give all in the name of the Death Corps. What others consider precious or is not to us. Gladly we shall lay down our lives in the cause of our Emperor.
The Siege of Vraks was a monumental conflict that took place in the later years of M41, which is implied by the name, focused upon the Imperial reclamation of Vraks Prime. While the conflict may have begun as little more than an attempted secessionist rebellion, it would eventually degenerate into a full-scale chaos incursion, one which would involve not only the forces of the traitor legions themselves, but also the demonic servants of the Chaos Gods. Over the course of 17 years, Imperial and heretic forces battled fiercely against one another in one of the bloodiest and most intense conflicts that occurred within recent Imperial memory, with losses on both sides tallying in the tens of millions. While the Imperium would technically claim a hard-fought victory, it would ultimately prove to be entirely Pyrrhic. Indeed, not only would Vraks be reduced to little more than a ruined wasteland, with its resources and manufacturing capabilities drained and reduced to the point of uselessness, the world itself would be placed under an indefinite quarantine by the Inquisition, entirely due to the lingering taint of chaos. Regardless of this cost, the Siege of Vraks remains a notable and indeed infamous example of what will happen should worlds turn from the light of the Emperor, as well as demonstrating the lengths that the Imperium will go to in order to reclaim what it deems to be rightfully its own.
When the maelstrom descends, Vraks shall overflow with blood and skulls, and even the dead shall find no peace. Millions shall be sacrificed in their names, and the true gods will rejoice. I've seen it, for I am the Messiah of the coming apocalypse.
In 804 M41, following the death of Cardinal Astral Borja, his protege, a man named Xaphan, would become appointed to the Holy Synod of the Ecclesiarchy as new Cardinal Astral of the Scaris sector. Before he could formally take his place within the council chamber of the Ecclesiarchal Palace, Xaphan instead declared that he would embark upon a tour of his new diocese, a pilgrimage that lasted for approximately 5 Terran Standard years. During this time, thanks in part to the influence of his subordinate, one Deacon Mammon, an individual who had risen rapidly to become Xaphan's chief advisor, the Cardinal declared his intent to launch a holy crusade against the enemies of mankind. Such a venture was in and of itself an incredibly risky one, due to the existence of laws governing the ecclesiarchy with regards to anything it might consider a militaristic venture. In particular, one subclause of this decree was most apt in this situation, one that explicitly forbid the Imperial Church from utilizing men under arms. Knowing that his actions would undoubtedly attract the attention of the Imperial Inquisition, Xaphan, at Mammon's suggestion, began preparations for his war of faith upon the secluded armory world of Vraks Prime, under the pretense of visiting the shrine to the martyr Saint Leonis the Blind. Taking up residence within the ecclesiarchal palace attached to the basilica, Xaphan ministered to the local population, who had welcomed him with an almost fanatical devotion. Over time, however, these appearances in public would become quite sporadic. The Cardinal appeared to be focusing his time and efforts on preparing for his crusade, or at least this was according to Deacon Mammon. Realizing that the War of Faith needed a considerable amount of manpower, Xaphan began to rouse the citizens of Vraks into a state of militant fanaticism, spreading rumors of heretics laying waste to nearby worlds, stating that the people of Vraks would be required to strike back against the unclean in the name of the Emperor. As a direct result of these sermons, conducted by Xaphan, the people of Vraks, and in particular those of the downtrodden and often abused lower classes, quickly began to see the Cardinal as a man of the people, continuing to be swept up in the tidal wave of religious zeal that was building. Those unfortunate souls that dared speak out against the Cardinal's actions, be they from the lay populace, the ecclesiarchy, or indeed the local planetary defense forces, were swiftly branded as traitors and heretics in their own right, and dealt with accordingly. But while Xaphan was slowly tightening his grip and expanding his influence across Vraks, his actions did not go unnoticed. Despite his best efforts in conducting his preparations in relative secrecy, the Inquisition's eyes were everywhere, and they had begun to turn their attention towards Vraks. Fearing that a cardinal was amassing too much personal power, that his sermons would potentially instigate an open conflict between the classes on the planet, the Ordo Hereticus dispatched a Vindicare assassin to eliminate the cardinal. The attempt was not a success. Thanks in part to his Rosarius, an ecclesiarchal icon containing within it what is effectively a force field generator, Cardinal Xaphan survived the attempt upon his life. Soon after this, various clergymen in service to the Cardinal began preaching to the people of Vraks that heretics and traitors, those they had been referring to all along, had now infiltrated the imperial government and were going to assassinate their beloved Cardinal. The news of it whipped the populace into a frenzy they had never seen before. The entire world soon erupted into an open revolt against the corrupt imperial government. The citizens of Vraks quickly overwhelmed the fortress precincts and covenants of the Adeptus Arbites and Adeptus Sororitas, before turning their attention towards the various installations owned by the Administratum, murdering the world's master prefect in the process. Vraks Prime was now under the control of Cardinal Xaphan. Such an act effectively seceded it from the Imperium, but as an administratum fortress world, specifically under the purview of the Departmentum Unitorum, Vraks Prime was key in supplying not just the sector, but the entire segmentum, with weaponry, munitions, and vehicles, all bound for the Astra Militarum. The Munitorum moved swiftly, at least in terms of imperial bureaucracy. An army must be raised for the purpose of reclaiming Vraks Prime and reintegrating it within the imperial fold. The army, which would eventually become known as the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, was comprised of over 30 Astra Militarum regiments drawn from the ranks of the Death Corps of Krieg. The reasoning for the selection of the Death Corps is that the Departmentum Unitorum knew that Xaphan's forces would not only be well armed, thanks to all the supplies present upon Vraks itself at the time of its seizure, but also had plenty of time to reinforce their already very fortified positions. The Death Corps were famed throughout the Imperium as specialists in both trench and siege warfare. They were, in all capacities, the perfect choice to take on the renegade Vraks militia. As the Imperium set out with its plans to retake Vraks, Deacon Mammon, unbeknownst to others, had long since fallen to the temptations of chaos. His tendrils had been at work with Cardinal Xaphan for years. It is quite likely that the uprising was indeed planned by him. At this point in time, he was making his own preparations to repel what he saw as an inevitable imperial assault. Deacon Mammon was himself training an elite unit of troops comprised of the most highly trained and deeply loyal members of Xaphan's regime, coming to be known appropriately enough as the Disciples of Xaphan. In 812 M41, the first of many imperial convoys containing troops and materials began amassing within the Vraks system. By 813 M41, the Siege of Vraks was well and truly beginning.
The heretic and blasphemer can offer no excuse for their crimes. Those who are pardoned merely live to further shroud humanity from the light of the Emperor with the darkness of their souls.
After deploying their forces within the Van Meersland wastes, the Death Corps began subjecting the outer Vraksian defense lines to an intense and almost continuous artillery bombardment. The defenders would respond in kind, unleashing their own big guns upon Imperial positions, with the resulting bombardment and counter-bombardments lasting for days at a time. As the two sides continued with their dueling artillery barrages, troops from the Death Corps' 158th Regiment began digging foxholes and establishing a series of interconnecting trench lines, although they would nonetheless sustain heavy casualties from enemy artillery strikes ranging these outer positions. Eventually, the Death Corps unleashed their infantry against the Vraksians, well over 50,000 troops throwing themselves at the enemy over the course of a mere 48 hours. While Imperial forces sustained heavy casualties, they did succeed in capturing several trenches belonging to the traitors, although these gains would ultimately be considered minor, even potentially insignificant in the grand scheme of the siege. The first true pitched battle would take place roughly 1 year into the conflict. The Death Corps launched an assault upon a strategically important fortress known as A453, with vast numbers of tanks and grenadiers exploiting an initial beachhead. Despite once again suffering extensive losses during the course of the battle, Imperial forces managed to successfully break through the outer Vraksian defenses, forcing the traitors to not only fall back, but eventually commit to a full-scale retreat, allowing the Death Corps to successfully capture Fort A453. Approximately 2 years into the siege, Vraksian forces launched their first major counter-offensive in an attempt to reclaim the territory and ground it had lost during the first initial Imperial Breakthrough. Unfortunately for the Imperials, it succeeded in catching the Death Corps completely unaware. While the besiegers did manage to repel the initial offensive, the traitor Vraksians would manage to break through Imperial lines after 2 straight days of brutal fighting, which in turn forced the Imperial commander, Lord Zwelk, to alter if not outright cancel many of his at this point already planned future offensives. The conflict began rapidly devolving into both sides being locked in a cycle of offensive and counteroffensive, lasting no less than 5 years Terran standard. A carnage so great that the number of casualties sustained by both Imperial and Vraksian forces were now totaling in the millions. Unbeknownst to the Imperium, however, the war upon Vraks had attracted the attention of an even greater threat than militiamen in a citadel: the Astartes of the Alpha Legion.
Let no good deed go unpunished. Let no evil deed go unrewarded.
Approximately 7 years into the Siege of Vraks, the Anarchy's Heart, a battle barge belonging to the Alpha Legion warband known as the Faithless, having been attracted to the conflict, slipped past the Imperial blockade and landed its troops upon the surface of Vraks Prime. Disguised as loyalist Space Marines, the Alpha Legion, led by the Chaos Lord Arcos the Faithless, infiltrated the Death Corps battle lines and proceeded to cross into No Man's Land, under the pretense of launching an assault upon Cardinal Xaphan's citadel. In truth, however, Arcos pledged his support to the Cardinal in the name of the Chaos Gods, promising that more allies would in time come to aid Xaphan in his war against the Imperium. Realizing that Arcos's millennia of battlefield experience would prove an incredible tactical asset, and that the Astartes themselves were of course supremely powerful shock troops, Xaphan eagerly and graciously accepted the offer from the Chaos Lord, immediately putting his new allies to work. Commander Zwelk would soon be receiving reports of the Alpha Legion's involvement in the war, frantically sending requests to Imperial Command for reinforcements given this new development. Vraksian forces gradually began to adorn themselves with the iconography of Chaos Undivided, as they began to fall deeper into corruption and depravity. Much to Zwelk's relief, his calls for aid were answered by none other than the Dark Angels chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. What was particularly surprising about this development, however, is that the Dark Angels had mobilized no less than half of their chapter's total strength under arms, and the forces were being personally led by their chapter master, Supreme Grand Master Azrael. What Zvulk and the Death Corps did not realize, however, is that the reason for the Dark Angel's involvement was primarily due to the chapter believing that the Alpha Legion had information pertaining to their secret quest in hunting down the Fallen, warriors from the original Dark Angel's Legion that had turned traitor over 10,000 years ago. The Dark Angels moved quickly to deploy their forces, intent on capturing the world's primary starport from the traitors. After 8 days of fighting, which saw Azrael facing off against Arcos in an intense one-on-one duel, Imperial forces succeeded in capturing the port from the traitors, forcing the Alpha Legion into a temporary withdrawal. Unbeknownst to the Imperium, however, Arcos had ordered his warband sorcerers to begin transmitting a psychic signal through the warp in order to summon allies to the war-torn world. With the momentum now on the side of the Imperium, Commander Zvulk organized a full-scale offensive in an attempt to put an end to the siege once and for all, very ahead of the projected timeline. The Death Corps now charged across no man's land, with Imperial artillery unleashing an intense and devastating barrage upon the enemy in hopes of causing breakthroughs. The resulting attack saw both Imperial and traitor forces sustaining and even for the Siege of Vraks, obscene amount of casualties. The Death Corps advance was slowed to what was essentially a crawl. Little or no progress was made over the course of 3 whole days. On the 4th day of the Imperial advance, the Corps would finally succeed in breaking through the Vraksian lines, and victory for the Imperium appeared, at this point, to be, according to Zvulk, all but certain. The hope was, however, short-lived. A massive Traitor Legion armada materialized within the Vraks system. Arcos' allies had arrived.
Attack is the only order worth remembering.
While Imperial forces had focused much of their attention upon events occurring on the surface of Vraks, their orbital defenses remained more or less neglected as a result. In spite of the valiant efforts made by Imperial Rear Admiral Rasiak, the forces of Chaos would succeed in overwhelming the Loyalists in the orbital volume, forcing many of them to withdraw. Soon after this, the Berserkers of Scalathrax, a Chaos Space Marine warband from the World Eater's Traitor Legion, began rapidly deploying their forces to the planet's surface, while the Death Corps were preoccupied with their assault upon Mortuary Ridge, a strategically vital location overlooking the fortress of Cardinal Xaphan. The World Eater's sudden deployment, combined with the accompanying orbital bombardment, took the Death Corps completely by surprise, the ensuing slaughter forcing guardsmen into a full-scale retreat. Not only this, but forces from another number of World Eater warbands, in addition to those of the Iron Warriors, Death Guard, and Black Legion, also began making their way to the surface to join the carnage. Worse yet for the Imperium, the Legio Vulcanum, a traitor Titan Legion, had also made planetfall. Imperial forces were now finding themselves the victims of devastating counterattacks. Emboldened by the arrival of heretic Astartes, the entrenched Vraksian militia themselves charged into the fray, with the Death Corps quickly beset upon all sides by traitorous forces. Commander Zvulk eventually was dismissed for his failures by Segmentum Command, one of the highest regional-level divisions within the Departmentum Unitorum. Command of Imperial forces was given to Marshal Kargori, who would then proceed to organize a relief force consisting of additional Death Corps regiments and Titans drawn from the Legio Astorum. The Imperial army, however, would not be the sole recipient of a change of leadership. Xaphan himself was rapidly losing control over his troops due to the newly arrived heretic Astartes, who frequently assumed direct command over their Vraksian charges, reducing the Cardinal to nothing more than a figurehead for the conflict as a whole. In time, Xaphan's public appearances grew even more sporadic than they already had been, until he disappeared from public eye altogether. Several weeks later, Battlefield Scarus of the Imperial Navy emerged within the Vraks system to find that most of the Traitor Legion vessels had moved on from Vraks itself in search of new worlds to plunder, with only a handful of ships remaining in orbit, specifically the Anarchy's Heart, Arcos the Faithful's personal flagship, and its accompanying escorts. The Alpha Legion vessels attempted to launch an ambush on the Imperial Navy, but were ultimately forced to withdraw from the system entirely. Imperial reinforcements had finally made it to the world's surface, and through sheer numbers and firepower, succeeded in stalling the traitors' counter-offensive, forcing both sides to once again dig in and brace themselves for an inevitable round of attritional warfare. In an attempt to undermine traitor fortifications, Marshal Kargori dispatched a number of Death Corps engineering and sapper teams to tunnel beneath the enemy lines in an attempt to sabotage their defenses and attack the traitors from behind, leading to what would eventually become known as the War Beneath Vraks. Fully moving in this attempt to keep momentum in the Imperium's favor, Kargori prepared his forces for a full-scale offensive against the traitors. While they were initially repelled, the offensive would eventually succeed in taking and securing multiple objectives from the enemy. The heretic Astartes, however, would once again launch their own series of counter-offensives against the Death Corps, forcing both sides into, yet again, another stalemate. Seeing no end in sight for the conflict, the Adeptus Administratum, the bureaucratic arm of imperial government, began to announce their intention to gradually withdraw a number of Death Corps regiments from Vraks in order to redeploy them to other, more pressing theaters of war. This act would only succeed in prolonging the imperial war effort upon Vraks. In desperation, Kargori dispatched a number of delegates to the nearby Cantus system in order to request aid from the Red Scorpions chapter of the Adeptus Astartes.
There is no greater transgression than to betray the Emperor's will.
After several months of deliberation by the chapter's warriors, the Red Scorpions would eventually agree to lend their aid to Imperial forces upon Vraks. Catching their foes completely off guard, the Red Scorpions cut a bloody swathe of destruction through Vraksian forces, and eventually succeeded in securing a breach located within the region designated as Sector 5744. The traitors launched a counter-offensive against Imperial forces in an attempt to counteract this time spearheaded by the Titans of the Legio Vulcanum, although the Chaos Titans would be forced to withdraw thanks to the valiant efforts of the god machines of the Legio Astorum. Repelling the enemy and securing the breach, the Red Scorpions temporarily withdrew from the conflict. Their mission was seemingly complete. They entrusted the remainder of the Imperial war effort to those forces already present upon Vraks. Soon after this, however, a series of ill omens and portents would begin to spread across not just the surface of the world, but throughout the entirety of the Vraks system, signaling, to many, an impending demonic incursion. Indeed, many of the heretic Astartes upon Vraks Prime, instead of aiding their Titan allies in the counter-offensive against the Red Scorpions, had chosen to focus their efforts on performing summoning rituals to allow their warp-spawned allies to begin manifesting within real space. Little did the traitors realize, however, that their actions had attracted the attention of Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex of the Ordo Malleus, who would go on to petition that other Inquisitors within the Scaris Conclave aid him in assuming direct control over the entire Vraksian war effort, so as to prevent the world from falling in its totality, transforming into a corrupted demon world. Despite some initial opposition from members of the Ordo Hereticus, who believed the war upon Vraks fell under their jurisdiction, Hector Rex's request would be granted by the other members of the Conclave by the narrowest of margins. The Inquisitorial Lord traveled to Vraks, accompanied by warriors drawn from the ranks of both the Grey Knights and Red Hunters Space Marine chapters. After arriving upon the world and meeting with Marshal Kargori, Hector Rex did indeed assume total control over Imperial forces for the remainder of the siege, while a number of lesser Inquisitors went on to act as his lieutenants. Rex began laying out his plans for an assault upon Xaphan's citadel, in where his forces would encircle the enemy before advancing en masse to prevent their escape, systematically cutting them down in the process. The proverbial noose around the necks of the traitors appeared now to be tightening. As operations went underway, the soldiers of the Death Corps' 30th Regiment were forced to fight through what would be termed as a green hell. They encountered heavy resistance from a number of Traitor Legion warbands drawn from the ranks of the Death Guard. After 8 days of intense fighting which saw the Krieg advance being stalled by the dogged resistance of the traitors, who were making extensive use of chemical and biological weaponry, the Death Corps unleashed their own chemical weapons upon the Death Guard in a perhaps vain attempt to fight fire with fire. Such tactics ultimately had little to no effect upon the heretic Astartes. Despite this setback, the Death Corps remained ultimately undeterred from their push across no man's land, although they would, unsurprisingly, sustain heavy casualties as a result. And yet, while the Imperium continued in their advance, infighting began to break out between the various Traitor Legion warbands, as both supplies and morale began to run low. In the end, Xufor the Impaler, the leader of the warband of the World Eaters known as the Skull Takers, a devout follower of Cohorn if ever there was one, would stage a violent coup that saw him take control of the Vraksian rebellion. In doing so, this would prolong the war for the glory of his patron god. Arcos the Faithless, seeking to placate the berserker of the Blood God, betrayed Xaphan and allied his warband with the Skull Takers, allowing Xufor's warriors into Xaphan's inner sanctum, where they proceeded to butcher the apostate Cardinal's followers before imprisoning Xaphan within his own dungeon. Fearing for his life, Deacon Mammon fled the ensuing massacre to seek sanctuary within the ranks of the Death Guard warband known as the Tainted, offering his soul in the process to Nurgle, the Chaos God of pestilence and decay. The Plague God, learning that Mammon was ultimately the one responsible for turning Vraks into what was essentially a planet-sized charnel pit, rewarded the Deacon for his actions with the gift of apotheosis, transforming him into a demon prince. Meanwhile, Imperial forces, after many long and arduous attempts, finally succeeded in capturing and disabling several of the defense laser batteries that surrounded the Vraksian citadel. Thanks, however, in part to self-serving efforts of Lord Hector Rex's inquisitorial rivals, over a dozen Death Corps regiments were forced to withdraw from Vraks altogether, largely thanks to a direct order issued by the High Lords of Terra. This naturally significantly reduced the number of troops at the Lord Inquisitor's disposal. Undaunted, however, Rex continued to have his forces launch full-scale assaults upon Gate 579459, and while the attack nearly failed thanks to the savagery and ferocity of the Cohornate berserkers they faced, the Death Corps persevered, thanks in large part to sheer numbers, driving the traitors back. With the gate now in Imperial hands, Hector Rex prepared his men for a final push.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of the demon, I shall fear nothing, for I am what the demon fears.
Imperial forces under the Lord Inquisitor's command were tasked with assaulting the Vraks citadel from 3 directions simultaneously, a strategy which, in theory at least, would force the enemy to spread their defenses thinner in order to repel their forces. Utilizing Gorgon transports to carry them towards the steep slopes that led upwards towards the fortress, and supported by columns of tanks, the Death Corps threw themselves at the citadel's defenses, all the while with Imperial artillery and air support relentlessly bombarding the stronghold in an attempt to disable its void shields. Despite sustaining heavy losses during their initial advance, the Death Corps would nonetheless manage to cross no man's land, before proceeding to make their way up the hillside towards the citadel itself. Somewhat surprisingly, the Krieg would initially encounter little in the way of resistance as they made their way up the slopes, but this proved to be little more than a carefully baited trap, one that sought to draw Imperial forces in before cutting them down with a torrent of weapons fire unleashed by entrenched Vraksian forces. The Death Corps continued with their bloody and costly advance, as is their wont, with Imperial artillery succeeding ultimately in overcoming the citadel's void shields. With the collapse of these, an intense battle followed, lasting 7 days, erupting as Imperial forces attempted to clear out the citadel's central ravine. The defending Vraksians were so dug in that not even Titan fire from the supporting god machines of the Legio Astorum were successful in eliminating them. In a final attempt to expunge the traitors from the ravine, 150 Space Marines from the Red Hunters chapter launched an assault via drop pods into its very heart. Such a maneuver had been, however, anticipated by the traitors. The Astartes were slaughtered in the ensuing carnage. Imperial forces then proceeded to launch a number of additional assaults upon the ravine, although the Krieg were eventually forced to fall back and regroup after 2 entire regiments were completely wiped out by the enemy. Hector Rex planned for yet another attack, but he would have to wait now to ensure that adequate air support was in place. With the aid of dozens of Marauder-class bombers from the Aeronautica Imperialis, as well as the Titans of Astorum, the Death Corps of Krieg finally succeeded in capturing the ravine from the traitors. By this point, the Imperial advance had almost succeeded in reaching the stronghold's walls, although their lines would begin to be pushed back due to a Chaos Space Marine counterattack. The fighting grew so fierce that the walls of the citadel would be captured, lost, and recaptured no less than 6 times in the course of a single day. The heretic Astartes unleashed a number of monstrous constructs, their demon engines, upon their foes, temporarily pushing the Death Corps back. The next day, Hector Rex himself personally led the assault against the walls, one that was spearheaded by none other than the warriors of the Grey Knights chapter. As demon hunters, these were considered the perfect countermeasures for Rex to set loose against the monstrous abominations of the demon engines. Despite the best efforts of the traitors, Imperial forces succeeded in capturing and holding onto the lower gate spur, before eventually pushing on towards an entrance designated as Cardinal's Gate. Elsewhere, the Red Scorpions chapter redeployed to the planet's surface, beginning their own assault upon the citadel, where they would attempt to capture the St. Leonis Gate, another one of the stronghold's primary entrances. While the Red Scorpions would manage to push deep into enemy lines, forcing many of their foes to fall back in the process, they would prove too late to prevent the traitors from completing their summoning ritual, resulting in a mass horde of demonic entities spilling from the warp into real space, all upon Vraks' surface. While the demons slaughtered and butchered all within their path, the Red Scorpions held fast, refusing to surrender even an inch of ground to such foul creatures. Meanwhile, Hector Rex's men also came under assault from the demons. However, thanks to the presence of the Grey Knights, they were able to overcome. The tide briefly appeared to turn in the favor of chaos, however, thanks to the arrival of Angrath, a gargantuan bloodthirster of Cahorn, a greater demon, who proceeded to tear his way through Astartes' mortals and vehicles with equal abandon. Hector Rex, summoning every ounce of his skill and willpower, succeeded ultimately in banishing the brute to the depths of warp space after a short but incredibly intense duel. As the Imperial attack pushed its way deeper and deeper towards the heart of the citadel, warriors from the loyalist Angels of Absolution Astartes chapter unexpectedly appeared upon Vraks, proceeding to launch an all-out assault where they would specifically hold positions that had been previously held by Arcos the Faithful and his Alpha Legion brothers. Despite Arcos managing to slay Chapter Master Afrir in the ensuing battle, the Angels of Absolution, who, unbeknownst to other Imperial forces, were carrying out a secret mission bestowed upon them by Azrael of the Dark Angels, ultimately managed to capture Arcos and a number of his followers, before, at this point, departing from Vraks. They would, however, in their parting, ensure that the traitor's warship was utterly destroyed before leaving the system. By this point, Imperial forces had breached the Citadel's defenses and were pouring into the stronghold, forcing the remaining traitor Astartes to flee through a series of warp gates constructed over the long years of the siege. Before leaving, however, the traitors managed to summon a warband of Cahornate demons led by the demon prince Uraka Azbaramael. However, thanks to the arrival of additional reinforcements from the Grey Knights, Azbaramael's horde would eventually be banished from Vraks, the rift that had brought them to the material realm sealed forever. The battle was now finally over. The Imperium had won, although it would ultimately prove the truest of Pyrrhic victories. 17 million casualties had died over the course of the long, long conflict. In the dungeons of Vraks, remaining inquisitorial forces discovered a number of Adepta Sororitas still alive after all these years, despite suffering horrendous abuses and tortures over the almost 2 decades that they had been at the hands of Xaphan and his followers. As for Xaphan himself, the former Cardinal had at some point evidently displeased his new masters, having been transformed into a gibbering, mindless abomination of fused flesh and bone, known colloquially as a Chaos Spawn. While Vraks was now within Imperial hands once more, the world had become little more than a blasted wasteland. What resources and manufacturing capabilities it had were exhausted over the course of the conflict, and due to the presence of demonic entities upon its surface, the world would now be placed under indefinite quarantine by order of the Inquisition. The Siege of Vraks can ultimately be summed up as a war where little was gained, but for an exorbitant effort and cost of life. In truest fashion, the most perfect of Imperial wars. That concludes this edition of 40k Lore for Newcomers. If you like this video, consider supporting 40k Theories upon Patreon for more content. To those of you who are new to 40k, we hope you learned something. Leave a comment below, and as ever, thank you for watching.